Hi, this is U.S. History, and today we are looking at North America before the French and Indian War and during the French and Indian War. This will be the beginning of Unit 2 as we start to talk about the causes of the American Revolution and then start to talk about the Revolution itself. You've got to remember this, in terms of causes of the American Revolution, the French and Indian War, although it's a separate war, is a cause in and of itself of the American Revolution. So that war caused this war. So let's get right into it. Looking at the dates here, don't forget 1754 to 1763. I don't make you remember a lot of dates, but 1607 is important, 1492 is important, 1763 is very, very important. And we'll talk about why today. Now looking at our timeline here, as we're going through, we're in the mid-1700s, between 1754 and 1763. That's when the French and Indian War takes place. So we worked our way through much of the 1700s pretty quickly, including the Great Awakening. Now we're looking at the French and Indian War, which will move eventually all the way up here to 1770s when we're going to fight the American Revolution. Now, North America before the French and Indian War looked quite different than it did afterwards. By 1750, Britain and France had become serious rivals, mainly because both nations used mercantilism. That means they were both using colonies to increase their wealth. So if one country has colonies in North America and another country has colonies in North America and they're close to each other, you're going to start to get some tension as they begin fighting over land. And that's exactly what happened between England and France. Britain and France went to war 3 times in Europe between 1690 and 1750, so you can tell they like to fight a lot. These wars in Europe meant that their colonists would also be fighting too. So England's colonists, the Americans, are also going to be fighting in this war against the French. So North America before the war, during the 1700s, both the British and French colonies were growing. Land disputes among the Ohio River Valley led to the French and Indian War. So looking at this particular map here, I don't know how well you can see it on the recording, but in blue here, you can see this is Quebec, and all of this land among the rivers and the Great Lakes belonged to France. Okay? This river right here, of course, is the mighty Mississippi River, runs south from the Great Lakes all the way down into the Gulf of Mexico, and they started the port of New Orleans. Orleans was a town back in France, and of course, remember, they don't come up with anything new, they just name it after the old place. New Orleans is right down here. So they settle all along those waterways, but the British, on the other hand, which will represent with their military color, which is red, they settle all along the coast. That's where their 13 colonies are. So that's the British. And then down to the south in Florida are the Spaniards. Okay? The part they're fighting about is this part right here in the middle. Okay? This part right here, which is extremely fertile. And because of the mighty Ohio River, which runs right here, this is an especially fertile place. So they call it the Ohio River Valley. Now, the French want it, the British want it. The problem is there's one group of people that already live there, and it's the Native Americans. So this war is going to be fighting over this area right here. And I also need to mention that separating the British from the Ohio River Valley is a mountain range. You're probably familiar with it. It starts down here in Georgia, and that's the mountain range, and it's called the Appalachian Mountains. And that's one reason that the British had not tried to go further than they had already. So this impacted the Indians too, as you can see, because they lived in the Ohio River Valley. The French increased their alliances with the Native Americans along there, so they become more powerful, the French do, because they're nicer to the Indians. Why? Remember our phrase, the French were friendly with the Indians for fur. They had been in the fur trade with them for years, so they already had good relationship with them. The British, on the other hand, had done nothing but take land from the Indians, so they had a bad relationship with the Indians. And the spread of the British colonists into the backcountry, they began going across the Appalachian Mountains and into Indian territory and trying to take more land. That caused more tension between the Indians and the British, as the British are trying to take more of their land in the Ohio River Valley. Now, if you take a look at this picture, I ask you to think about what you see here. This is a trading post, and you can see that there's some Europeans here, and there's some Indians here, and they're trading. They're trading furs, mainly things like beaver pelts. Beavers, of course, live in the water, but they're also mammals, so their pelts are very valuable because they're waterproof. So they became very valuable trading commodities. So this is the French trading with the Indians, and that's why the French were friendly with the Indians for fur. And that's why they fought on the same side during the French and Indian War. So in 1754, colonists from across the English colonies met in Albany, New York, at what was called the Albany Congress, to discuss the common problem of Indian attacks. What are they going to do about it? Now, granted, they were getting attacked because they were taking more Indian land, but still they wanted to do something about it. So Benjamin Franklin proposed the Albany Plan of Union. Now, he was a little bit younger back then, but he had a good idea. He said, if we're going to defend ourselves, the British aren't going to do it. So what we need to do is basically have our own standing army, and we need to unite. But what you've got to understand is, even though there were 13 American colonies, they didn't feel very American at all. People from Georgia did not too much care what happened in New York or Massachusetts, and vice versa. So there was just no unity about this, so the plan was not approved. They lacked the proper unity. And during that time, Benjamin Franklin came up with America's first political cartoon. Now, you can look at this picture and you can start to deduce what it means. First of all, you see a snake, and that snake is cut up into parts. And there's abbreviations by each one. And those represent different colonies or parts of colonies. New England, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and so forth. So you look at this and you can tell it's separated. And it says join or die. So what was Benjamin Franklin trying to say? Well, a snake that's cut up is not worth much. He's not very dangerous, is he? But a snake that's whole is very dangerous. If we join together, we can be very powerful. But if we don't, we're going to perish. That's what Benjamin Franklin was trying to say. And this picture is going to be used for many years as they approach the American Revolution as well. But it wasn't originally from that. It was originally from the Albany Plan of Union many years before the American Revolution. So let's look at the French and Indian War itself. We looked at the time before it. The turning point happens in 1754 when things begin to get out of control. Again, you can see the purple part here, that belongs to France. They call Quebec up here, they called it New France. Then we've got the British colonies over here in blue. And then the area that's kind of this disputed territory is in blue and purple stripes right here, the Ohio River Valley. And of course the mountain range right there in the middle. So what happens to get things going? Well, enter George Washington, who was a young man then. He was only 22. And in 1754, the Virginia governor sent him to protect an Ohio Company claim for the British. So he goes to Fort Duquesne. That's D-U-Q-U-E-S-N-E, Fort Duquesne. And he goes there to basically tell the British tell the French, hey, look, you're in British territory, you need to leave. Well, they didn't leave, and George Washington barely escaped with his life and made it back home. Washington troops were forced to retreat from Fort Duquesne, and that clash proved to be the beginning of the French and Indian War. Now, with the words French and Indian War, that can be confusing. It might lead you to think that the French were fighting the Indians. No, in fact, it was the British and their colonies in North America versus the French, their colonies, and the Indians. Okay? So the British are fighting the French and the Indians, and that's where we get the name of this war. The French and the Indians is who the British were fighting. That's what's called the French and Indian War. You say, Well, why would it be called that? Why is it not the Britain and French War? Well, first of all, they had fought each other quite a bit. Second of all, it's kind of like when we play a football team, you say we're playing ECI on Friday night. That's the ECI game, right? You're letting people know that's who you're playing, that's who you're competing against. So it's sort of the same thing here. The French versus their Indian allies, because remember the Indians had a good relationship with the French, that's why they're on the same team here. The war started in North America, 1754, goes to 1763, but it becomes part of a larger world war called the 7 Years' War, which lasts from 1756 to 1763 due to competition among those empires because of mercantilism and things like that. Fighting the French and Indian War, Britain was losing during the early years, but the colonists saw this war as another European conflict, and they didn't want to fight in it, and they sure didn't want to help pay for it. So when taxes are raised on the colonists, they become very angry with Britain for doing that. But in 1757, the British Prime Minister, who's kind of like, yeah, they have a king, but they also sort of have a president, like we have a president, that they call him the Prime Minister. The British Prime Minister was William Pitt, for whom Pittsburgh is named after, Pennsylvania, and he issues a blank check to win the war. So if I take a check out of my checkbook and I don't write a number on it, I just sign it at the bottom, and I hand you something, I hand you that check, and I say, I don't care how much it costs, write the number down. That's a blank check. You could put a big number on that thing, couldn't you? Well, that's what Britain does under William Pitt. They write a blank check. They say, I don't care how much it costs, we're going to win the French and Indian War. And it costs a lot of money, and they pay a lot of money, but they win the war. So you need to remember the blank check helps them win the war. But why would he be willing to spend that much money? Remember, in mercantilism, England is an island. They don't have unlimited resources. That's why they need colonies. So if they lose their colonies, their entire economy falls apart. So they can't lose these colonies. They've got to spend whatever it takes to get the colonies. But on the downside, it puts them in a lot of debt. So Pitt understood winning this war meant the future of British mercantilism. So we end the war just like we end any war, with a treaty. A treaty is a document that officially ends a war. This treaty is called the Treaty of Paris, only because they signed it in Paris, France, of 1763. So the war officially ends with the Treaty of Paris of 1763. Mr. Fordham, why do I have to remember that date? Because there's two treaties of Paris. One is 1763, and the other is the Treaty of Paris of 1783, just 20 years later. That one ends the American Revolution. You do need to remember both of them. 1763 ends the French and Indian War. 1783, 20 years later, ends the American Revolution. You need to know both of them. So what happens after the war? Well, remember how things were before. You had the French over here, the Ohio River Valley disputed, and this region over here belongs to the British on their colonies. Now the French are out of there. They lose the war. The French and the Indians lose the war to the British. The British win. So that means the French are out of there. So now all this land that used to belong to the French belongs to the British. But the British did give a big chunk of what's the Louisiana, called the Louisiana Territory, to the Spanish. They give it to them. They're later going to take it back from them, but they don't want a fight with the Spanish, okay? They don't want to fight with them. They've just fought with the French. They're in debt, so they want to keep the Spanish happy. So they give a big chunk of this to the Spanish. And of course over here they have their colonies. All right, so the French lose Canada, most of their empire in India, and claims to land east of the Mississippi River. England gets all those French lands in Canada and exclusive rights to the Caribbean slave trade. And Spain gets all lands west of the Mississippi and New Orleans, but they lose Florida to England during this time. So Florida belongs to England. So what are the effects of the French and Indian War? We talked about causes, we talked about the fighting. What are the effects? Well, the French and Indian War changed the relationship between Britain and the colonists. Now they're even more tense with each other. The colonists were excited about the possibility of new land in the West. Now that the French were gone, now they wanted to move into that area. And the colonists learned new guerrilla fighting tactics from the Indians. They're going to use that guerrilla fighting in the American Revolution against the British, but they learned it from the Indians. So basically they used to fight lined up on fields, shooting at each other. No more. Now they pop out from behind a bush, shoot you, and then run away. And that's called guerrilla war. William Pitt's blank check led to huge war debts. Now when a country goes into debt, there's a number of things they can do. They can borrow more money and go deeper into debt. They can print more money, which is not good because it causes inflation, because the more of something you have, the less valuable it is. So it makes your money less valuable, so they don't want to do that, or they can tax their citizens. That's what they choose to do, and that includes taxing the colonists, and the colonists are not going to like that. Parliament, which is like the Congress in England, expected colonists to help pay off those debts, and more decisions would now be made by the British Parliament instead of those local assemblies like the House of Burgesses there in the colonies. So they don't have as much self-rule as they had, and they're not going to like that because we like that here in America. Other problems strained the relationship between Britain and the colonists. The expensive British Army was not removed from America. They were here, and they were marching up and down the streets, and people just didn't understand why that army had to stay here. It made them feel like they were being occupied like an enemy. The Ottawa Indians, led by Chief Pontiac, attacked the frontier settlers who were going into the Ohio River Valley, trying to move into that land that had been won from the French. So they have this incident called Chief Pontiac's War. Britain had to spend more money defending the colonists on the frontier, and they were already out of money. They were in debt. How are they going to pay for this? So as people began expanding into this region that's called the Ohio River Valley, they're taking more Indian land, making the Indians more mad. The Indians are attacking, and it's just causing more and more problems. So I said Chief Pontiac's Wars, Pontiac's Rebellion, and that's the name of this incident that happens between Chief Pontiac and the colonists going into that region. So after Pontiac's Rebellion, the British decide, listen, we can't defend these people anymore. We don't have the money, we don't have the manpower, so they just don't need to move into the Ohio River Valley. They need to stay where they're at for now until we can get things under control. So they issue the Proclamation of 1763. That's the same year as the Treaty of Paris. So basically what they do is they draw something called the Proclamation Line down the top, the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and it tells the colonists you can't move to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. You stay in the original colony area on the east side, on the coast. Do not move into the Ohio River Valley because we don't want you to die and we can't go defend you. Now that made the colonists mad because they said, we worked really hard to win this land. Why can't we move out there? And again, the British are like, we don't want you to die. So there's tension here between the colonists who want to move there anyway and the British who say, no, we don't have the money to defend you. And also, Parliament made that decision, and it wasn't decided by a local colonial assembly like the House of Burgesses. They said, you didn't ask us. The Parliament says, well, we don't have to. So if you look right here, this red line right here, this runs across the top of the Appalachian Mountains, and it's called the Proclamation Line. And it tells the people living in the colonies over here, you can't move to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. This is the line, do not cross it. If you do, you could be arrested. So don't come over here. It's for your own safety. Even though this is great land over here, even though we want it, there's Indians there and they'll attack you and kill you, and we don't have the money to defend you right now. And we're trying to tax you to get that money back, but you don't want to pay taxes either. So there's a lot of tension between America and Britain. So the French and Indian War brought an end to salutary neglect. Now, salutary neglect simply means that there were laws that were not being enforced. So the Navigation Acts, they were in place. You weren't supposed to trade with any other country besides the mother country, but you're 3,000 miles away, so it's really hard to enforce that. Now they're going to enforce it. Okay? It would be kind of like this. It would be like if the speed limit on the interstate is 70 miles an hour, and they let you by with going 75 for years and years and years and not pull you over. Now overnight they're going to pull you over for going 72. You're not going to like that. It's a big change in a short period of time where they were being very lenient. Now they're going to be very strict. When they were being very lenient, they were neglecting those laws. It was called salutary neglect. The word neglect means to let it go. Just let it go. You can't enforce it. You can't do anything about it. Let it go. So they let it go. Then when they crack the whip on them, when they become more strict, that's called parliamentary sovereignty. Now they need the money, so they're going to start enforcing the Navigation Acts and all these other acts that the colonists had been ignoring. And of course, that's going to tick the colonists off even more. So you can see we're coming to a boiling point where the colonists and the English are going to eventually start fighting each other. They don't consider themselves to be British anymore. They're starting to consider themselves to be something else, Americans. So the English officials assume that Parliament must have all ultimate authority over all laws and taxes, and the British began governing their colonies more strictly. Also remember this, the colonists didn't have any representatives from the colonies in British Parliament. So they're angry and they say, look, you're going to tax us, but we don't have representation in Parliament. So don't tax us unless you give representation in Parliament so we can have some say in how that tax money is spent. In other words, no taxation without representation, which will become a rallying cry for the causes of the American Revolution. That word parliamentary sovereignty means Parliament has the authority to rule. They are sovereign. So to end salutary neglect meant that new taxes and laws were passed without asking those colonial assemblies. As Britain assumed more control, the colonies tried to hang on to the power in the colonial assemblies, and this shift would prove to be the beginning of a long road towards colonial independence. And that's going to do it for the French and Indian War. Have a good day.